At my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law grabbed the back of my head and shoved my face into a bowl of steaming chicken soup. "Go on." She laughed loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "Try the dish. Maybe it'll teach you some manners." For a moment nobody moved. The music stopped. The room fell silent. I could feel the hot broth running down my cheeks, soaking my dress, while dozens of guests simply watched. The worst part wasn't the burning that it was seeing my own son standing only a few feet away, doing absolutely nothing. That I slowly reached for a napkin, wiped my face, and smiled. That I didn't yell, that I didn't cry, that I simply walked away. What happened after that wedding changed every single person in that room forever. That I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the very end, and tell me what city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far my story has traveled. That morning had begun so differently that I woke up before sunrise, unable to sleep because my heart was full of excitement. 68 years old. After raising my son Daniel alone since he was 12, I truly believed this wedding would be the happiest day of my life. That I carefully pressed my navy blue dress, polished the pearl brooch my late husband had given me on our 20th anniversary, and wrapped the handmade wedding gift I'd spent 6 months finishing. That as I looked into the mirror, I whispered softly, "Your father would be so proud of you today, Daniel." I had no idea those would be the last peaceful words I'd say before my entire world changed. Taojong, Sarah. The drive to St. Andrew's Church took less than 30 minutes, but I remember every mile as if it happened yesterday. The September sunshine bathed the streets in a warm golden glow, and everywhere I looked, I saw families beginning their weekends together. It felt like the kind of morning my late husband, Thomas, would have called a blessing from God. When I stepped out of my car, I paused for a moment to admire the old stone church. White roses framed the entrance. Soft violin music drifted through the open doors. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that our family had finally made it through the difficult seasons. Inside, guests greeted one another with hugs and laughter. I recognized neighbors, former teachers, and old friends who had watched Daniel grow from a shy little boy into a successful young man. Many smiled politely at me. A few thanked me for raising such a wonderful son. Those words filled my heart with quiet pride. Then I spotted Emily. She was standing near the altar, surrounded by bridesmaids, looking absolutely radiant. I walked over with a warm smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said gently. "You look beautiful." She glanced at me for barely a second. "Thanks," she replied flatly before turning back to her friends as though I had interrupted something important. The conversation continued without me. No one introduced me, no one invited me to stay. I stood there for another awkward moment before quietly stepping away. Maybe she's nervous, I told myself. Every bride has a stressful morning. I refused to let one cold moment ruin what was supposed to be the happiest day of my son's life. But deep inside, a small voice was beginning to whisper that something wasn't right. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Daniel stood at the altar with tears in his eyes as Emily walked toward him. For a few precious minutes, I forgot every uncomfortable moment from earlier. I watched my little boy, the same child who used to reach for my hand every time he was afraid, become a husband. I quietly thanked God for bringing him this far. But the feeling didn't last. When the guests moved into the ballroom for the reception, a young event coordinator greeted everyone with their seating cards. She smiled politely and handed me mine. I looked down. Table 27. I frowned. The bride and groom sat at table 1. Close family filled tables 2 through 5. Even distant relatives were seated near the dance floor. Table 27 was tucked into the far corner of the room, beside the kitchen doors where waiters rushed in and out carrying trays of food. First, I thought it had to be a mistake. I walked over to the coordinator and said gently, "Excuse me, dear. I believe there may have been a mix-up." Before she could answer, Emily suddenly appeared. "There isn't," she said with a perfectly practiced smile. "We thought you'd be more comfortable over there. It's quieter." Her words sounded polite, but her eyes told a different story. They weren't welcoming, they were dismissing me. I looked around the ballroom. Several guests had already noticed. Some quickly looked away. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. For the second time that day, I smiled. I thanked the coordinator, and I walked alone toward the loneliest table in the room. I tried to convince myself that the seating arrangement didn't matter. After all, I hadn't come for attention. I had come to celebrate my son's happiness. The reception hall slowly filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Waiters moved gracefully between the tables, serving appetizers while guests toasted the newlyweds. From my seat in the corner, I watched Daniel laugh with friends I hadn't seen in years several times. Our eyes almost met each time. He looked away. It felt as though there was an invisible wall between us. A few minutes later, Emily walked across the ballroom with effortless confidence. She stopped beside my table and smiled. The kind of smile that looked warm from a distance but felt cold up close. "I hope you're comfortable back here," she said sweetly. "It's easier this way. The photographers won't have to edit you out of the family pictures." The people sitting nearby froze. One woman lowered her glass. Another man stared down at his plate, pretending not to hear. Emily let out a soft laugh. "I'm only joking," she said. "But you know, weddings are for young people." No one laughed with her and no one defended me. Either I folded my hands quietly in my elapid. My husband had always told me that dignity wasn't measured by how people treated you. It was measured by how you chose to respond. So I smiled politely, and I whispered the words he used to tell me whenever life became difficult. "Stay calm, Maggie. Truth always arrives, even when it's late." At that moment, I had no idea how soon those words would be tested. Dinner was finally served. The aroma of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and homemade soup drifted through the ballroom as the guests settled into their seats. For a brief moment, the laughter returned. It almost felt like a normal wedding again. A waiter stopped beside my table and gently placed a bowl of steaming chicken soup in front of me. I smiled politely and thanked him. I had barely lifted my spoon when I heard the sound of high heels approaching. Emily, she stood beside me, holding a glass of champagne, her smile brighter than ever. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out, tapping her glass with a spoon. The room gradually fell silent. "I just want to thank everyone for making this the happiest day of our lives." Applause echoed through the ballroom. Then she turned toward me. "And I'd especially like to thank Daniel's mother." People smiled, expecting a heartfelt tribute. Instead, Emily leaned closer until only a few inches separated our faces. "You've always believed your cooking was the best," she whispered with a mocking grin. "So?" Before I could react, her hand pressed firmly against the back of my shoulder. My balance slipped and my face plunged forward into the bowl of steaming soup. The hot broth splashed across my cheeks, my chin, and the front of my dress. The spoon clattered onto the floor. Gasps filled the room. Then Emily laughed. "Go on," she said loudly. "Try the soup. Maybe now you'll finally learn what good cooking tastes like." No one moved and no one spoke. I slowly lifted my head, reached for a linen napkin, and wiped my face with trembling hands across the room. I looked at Daniel. He stared at me in complete shock, but he never took a single step toward his own mother. That moment, something inside me quietly broke. I didn't say a single word. I simply placed the napkin on the table, stood up, and walked toward the ladies' room behind me. The ballroom remained strangely quiet. The laughter had disappeared. Even the band had stopped playing. As I closed the restroom door, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Soup stained my dress. A few drops clung to my hair. My makeup was ruined, but somehow, the woman staring back at me looked stronger than the one who had entered the wedding that morning. I turned on the cold water and gently rinsed my face. The burning had already begun to fade. The ache inside my heart had not. A soft knock came at the door. "Ma'am." It was an older hotel attendant carrying a clean towel. "I thought you might need this." His voice was kind. Not pity, just kindness. I thanked him with a small smile as I stepped back into the hallway. Another gentleman was waiting nearby. Gray hair, dark navy suit, leather briefcase. It took me a second to recognize him. "Mrs. Parker." "I wasn't sure it was you." It was Richard Collins, the attorney who had worked with my late husband for nearly 20 years. He had witnessed everything from across the ballroom. "I'm so sorry for what happened," he said quietly. Then he lowered his voice. "Thomas asked me to speak with you if a day like this ever came." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard my husband's name spoken with such warmth in years. Richard looked around to make sure no one was listening. "There's something your son and his wife don't know." For the first time that day, I realized the story wasn't ending with my humiliation. It was only beginning. Richard led me into a quiet meeting room just off the hotel lobby. He closed the door gently before placing his leather briefcase on the table. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he slowly removed a thick manila envelope. Across the front, in my late husband's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 simple words. "For Margaret. When the time comes." The sight of Thomas's handwriting tightened my throat. Richard slid the envelope toward me but kept one hand resting on it. "Before you open this," he said calmly, "there's something you need to understand." I looked into his eyes. "Your husband loved you more than anyone I've ever known. He also knew that success has a way of changing people." I frowned. "What are you saying?" Richard took a slow breath. 3 months before Thomas passed away, he completely restructured the family's assets. I stared at him, unable to speak. He transferred the company, the investment accounts, and every major property into a family trust. I whispered, "Daniel inherited everything. Didn't he?" Richard slowly shook his head. "No. Daniel is a beneficiary. But he doesn't control a single dollar." I felt my heart pounding. "So? Who does?" Richard looked directly at me. "You do. You are the sole trustee. No one can sell the company. No one can mortgage the properties. No one can access the accounts without your written approval." Suddenly, every cold glance, every insult, every attempt to push me aside, made perfect sense. They believed I was powerless. They had no idea. The future they were already spending still belonged to me. I slipped the envelope back into Richard's briefcase without opening it. Not because I wasn't curious, but because for the first time that day I no longer felt rushed. Richard smiled faintly. "Thomas always said you were the strongest person he ever knew." I let out a quiet breath. "I don't feel strong." "You don't have to," he replied. "You only have to be patient." Before leaving, he handed me a business card. "Call me tomorrow morning. Don't confront anyone tonight. They still believe they're in control." I nodded. "They'll stay that way." When I walked back into the ballroom, the celebration was in full swing again. The music had returned. Guests were dancing. Champagne glasses sparkled beneath the crystal chandeliers. It was as if nothing had happened. Across the room, Emily stood surrounded by friends laughing loudly. As I passed by, I heard her say, "Now that Daniel and I are finally married, we'll be making a few changes." Someone asked, "Like what?" She grinned. "We're selling his mother's old house. It's outdated anyway. We'll use the money to buy a place with an ocean view." The group laughed approvingly. Emily never noticed I was standing only a few feet away. She spoke as though my life had already been erased. I simply adjusted my brooch, smiled to myself, and kept walking. She thought the house belonged to Daniel. She thought the company was already theirs. She thought humiliating me had ended the story. She was wrong, because tomorrow morning, everything she believed would begin to fall apart. The wedding ended just before midnight. I drove home alone. For the first time in years, the silence inside my car didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. When I reached my house, I carefully hung my stained navy blue dress in the laundry room. I didn't throw it away. I wanted to keep it exactly as it was. Not as a reminder of humiliation, but as proof of the day I finally stopped trying to earn respect from people who had already chosen not to give it. The next morning at precisely 9 o'clock, I walked into Richard Collins' law office. He was already waiting. Several folders lay neatly arranged on the conference table. "So," he asked gently, "are you ready?" I looked at my husband's photograph that stood on the bookshelf behind him. For a moment I could almost hear Thomas's voice. "Don't react in anger. Respond with wisdom." I smiled. "I'm ready." Richard opened the first folder. "The trust becomes fully active today." He slid a document toward me. "Your first responsibility as trustee is to protect the family's assets." I picked up the pen without hesitation. One signature. That was all it took. Within the next hour, the bank was instructed that no funds could be withdrawn without my written authorization. The company attorney froze every ownership transfer. Every pending property sale was placed on hold. Everything happened quietly, legally, professionally. No arguments. No revenge. Just the rules my husband had carefully put in place long before he passed away. At that very moment, Daniel and Emily were boarding a plane for their honeymoon, completely unaware that the life they thought they owned had just slipped beyond their reach. 10 days later, Daniel and Emily returned from their honeymoon. By then, the first cracks had already begun to appear. Their premium credit card was declined at the airport. Their attempt to transfer money into a new joint account had been rejected, and the realtor handling the beach house they wanted to buy had suddenly canceled the closing appointment. Emily blamed the bank. Daniel blamed paperwork. Neither of them imagined the truth. That afternoon, Richard invited them to his office for what he described as a routine review of the family trust. When they walked into the conference room, they looked confident. Emily even smiled when she saw me sitting quietly at the far end of the table. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said with a laugh. "I thought you were staying out of family business." I simply folded my hands and smiled politely. Richard cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming." He opened a thick binder and adjusted his glasses. "After reviewing the trust established by the late Thomas Parker, I'd like to clarify a few misunderstandings." The room suddenly became very still. He looked directly at Daniel. "You are a beneficiary." Daniel nodded confidently. "That's what I thought." Richard continued. "But you are not the owner of the company." Emily's smile disappeared. "The homes are not yours to sell. The investment accounts cannot be accessed. And every major financial decision requires the written approval of one person." Slowly, every eye in the room turned toward me. Emily stared in disbelief. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible." For the first time since the wedding, she realized she had humiliated the one person who held the future she had been counting on. Emily's confidence vanished in an instant. Her face turned pale as she looked from Richard to Daniel, and finally to me. "There has to be some mistake," she whispered. Richard calmly slid the trust documents across the table. "There is no mistake." For the first time since the wedding, Daniel looked directly into my eyes. His voice trembled. "Mom, I didn't know." I held his gaze for a long moment. "I believe you," I said quietly. "But not knowing doesn't erase what happened." The room fell silent. Then I reached into my handbag and carefully placed a folded white linen napkin on the table. It was the same napkin I had used to wipe the hot soup from my face on their wedding day. "I kept this," I said softly, "not to remember the humiliation, but to remind myself that dignity is something no one can take away unless we surrender it." No one spoke. Emily lowered her head. Daniel wiped away a tear. And for the first time, they understood that respect, once broken, is far more difficult to rebuild than wealth. 3 months have passed since that wedding. Life looks very different now. Emily is no longer part of our family. Daniel and I are slowly rebuilding a relationship that should never have been broken in the first place. It isn't easy. Trust rarely returns all at once. It comes back one honest conversation at a time. As for the family trust, I continue to protect it exactly as Thomas wished, not out of revenge, but out of responsibility. Sometimes I still look at the navy blue dress hanging quietly in my closet. The soup stains are gone, but I never had them completely removed. They remind me that pain doesn't define who we become. Our choices do. If that day taught me anything, it's this: never confuse silence with weakness. Some of the strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who refuse to let bitterness take over their hearts. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If this touched your heart, cherish the people who respect you, and never allow anyone, even family, to convince you that your dignity has a price. Because in the end, respect is earned, kindness is remembered, and dignity is something no one can take away unless you give it away yourself.